Hello and welcome to the Free IP Fandom. I'm your host, Felix Chaplin, and today I have the pleasure of interviewing someone who's been a friend of the channel since it first began in early 2021. For the past 4 years, today's guest has been making educational content about the 1920s on his channel, and he's been very helpful in my own journey here on YouTube. It is with great pleasure that I introduce our third guest, Harold Keaton from the 1920s channel. Hey Harold, how are you?
Hey, nice to be here.
Would you mind telling our listeners a little bit about what got you interested in the 1920s and what led to you creating your channel?
Yeah, so I moved to Japan a while ago. It's like 5 years ago. And I couldn't do a lot of my hobbies that I could do in America. I used to collect a lot of old things, like old letters and military stuff. And so I really needed a new hobby in Japan. And so I just decided to try to make a YouTube channel. I'd always been interested in the 1920s, but I wasn't really an expert on it. So I kind of wanted to use the channel as an excuse to learn more about the 1920s so I can learn as I went along. And it kind of just got more popular than I anticipated. And that's where I am today.
Oh, that's interesting. When you say that you were always into the 1920s, does that mean when you were a kid you were watching silent movies and stuff? You had some kind of awareness of like music from the 20s and stuff? How far back does your interest go?
Yeah, so that part, all the music and stuff, that kind of happened later. I'd been interested in history since I was a kid, but specifically the 1920s, that happened when I was actually in college, a little bit late. I think I watched my first silent film right before I went off to college, and I just kind of got interested in silent film first. Well, not first. I guess the music came first. I played Fallout games, and I was a big fan of those. So those didn't go quite back to the 1920s, the music in the game, but I kind of got interested in 30s and 40s music, and then I went back further, found the 1920s, and kind of loved it after that. And I just continued to watch silent movies when I was in college because it was free and I didn't have any money. So it was kind of fun to explore the Internet Archive back then.
Oh yeah, definitely. I can't remember. I think it was one of the Fallout games that had. I don't know anything about video games really, but I think it was one of them that had a recording of "Shine On Harvest Moon" with Billy Murray and Ada Jones. Do you know?
I think that might have been BioShock. I think they did have some 1920s and older music on that game.
Yeah, like I said, I don't know anything about video games. Moving on, when you were doing all your research and stuff for the channel, was there anything that you learned about the 1920s that was unexpected?
Yeah, so I guess when I started, I didn't realize that there was a lot of similarities between the 1950s and the 1920s, which was kind of random. They're both kind of post-war periods, and both of them are kind of regarded, in America at least, as sort of golden ages. And it was kind of interesting to compare the two and really see how similar they were. Obviously not in every way, but in a lot of kind of big picture ways, they're quite similar. So I thought that was a really random thing to learn.
Yeah, I know when this is one of your more recent videos that you just posted. You read something from a magazine about a proposal for an early kind of DVD in the 20s.
Oh yeah.
I found that one to be really interesting. You've made a ton of videos. Do you remember how many off the top of your head?
300, I think. Something over 300 maybe.
I can look it up. I think 345 it says. So that's a pretty big number to pick from, but out of all those videos, which one, or maybe we can go with top 3, are the ones you're most proud of?
I think the first one that comes to mind, they're kind of like a pair videos, the ones about radio. I was originally going to make them into one video, but then split them off into two, because one focused more on the development and one was more of just a survey of the kind of radio shows. And for that one, I had been reached out to by a sort of expert in the field. Her name is Dr. Donna Halper, and it was for a kind of unrelated thing about another radio-related video where she was correcting some information. So I kind of got involved with that, and she helped me get over some of the difficulties with doing research about 1920s radio. There's kind of a lot of misinformation and myths associated with it, and I really learned a lot going through all the magazines and that, and it kind of goes back to what I learned through research. I learned a lot about 1920s radio from researching for those videos. There's just a lot of stuff to cover, and I didn't really know how deep it was. I just kind of thought, oh, it was sort of a novelty and there's not too much depth to it, but that was definitely wrong once I looked into it a lot more.
Yeah, I think when people think of old-time radio, they're usually thinking of the 30s and 40s.
Yeah.
They're thinking of the Adventures of Superman and the Green Hornet and those kinds of, or like Jack Benny, those kinds of things that came later. Like in all these places that preserve like old time radio, you don't really see much of stuff from the 1920s. It's all like 30s and 40s mainly. So I assume that was one of the hurdles that you had to overcome, like trying to find some stuff that was from like radio broadcasts that were from the 1920s.
Yeah, there's not too many that survive. So I think a lot of the things I had to look at were just like, if you look in some radio magazines, you can occasionally find transcripts of a broadcast that doesn't exist physically, and just some other like articles about programs. So you sort of have to glean information through that way, because there's only a handful of them that actually survive, and a lot of them aren't especially interesting, to be honest. It's just kind of 30 minutes of music, really, for a majority of them.
Yeah, well, you know, that was still the early time when they were still figuring out what works and stuff, though, so it wasn't as developed. You know, like when they were first testing television out, you know, it was still cutting-edge technology back in the 20s. It wasn't, like, commercially available where you can, you know, just go to the store and buy a TV and start watching it. But anyway, moving on. Some of the content that you've made has been reviews of books from the 20s. So out of the ones that you've read, which ones would you want to see made into a movie?
I think my favorite book from the 20s that I've read and done a video about was An American Tragedy from 1925. I think it was the first book I reviewed on the channel, and it was kind of an interesting moment because I just found it randomly at a bookstore. I'd never heard of it before. I just saw it was from the 20s, so I thought I'd use it. And it's a surprisingly deep book. There's a lot of social commentary in it and a lot of things about human nature that I thought were interesting, and I think it could really be a good nuanced movie. Not so much like a Hollywood blockbuster sort of one, but I'm thinking of like Martin Scorsese or something taking it on. It has been made into a movie before in I think 1931, but I'm sure that it didn't go that deep back then.
Well, 1931 was still pre-code, so I mean, if you haven't seen it yet, you never know. There's some pretty crazy stuff in those pre-code movies.
Yeah.
Staying on the topic of movies, which movies from the 1920s do you think should be watched by more people?
Like underrated ones?
Yeah. I mean, like, you know, people are going to usually think of like Metropolis and Nosferatu and try to go off the beaten path with this one.
The first one that comes to mind is it's fairly well known in the sort of like film circle, but not mainstream. It's a Japanese film called A Page of Madness from 1926, I believe. And it is very weird. It's like an artsy movie, and there's pretty much I think there's no title cards, or very, very, very few title cards. So you have to understand everything through visual only, and it gets a little bit trippy. There's a lot of artistic things used in it, and the first time I watched it, I had no idea what was going on. So I had to look up like what it was trying to say, what the story was, and once you kind of get some hints, it becomes a little bit easier, but it can still be a challenging first watch because you just kind of get lost in the whole thing, but there actually is a story there. It has a lot of like horror elements to it, and 1920s horror is pretty interesting, and these were like kind of Japanese aesthetic horror, which is kind of a whole thing in itself, and there's not a lot of Japanese movies from the 20s that still survive, so yeah, I kind of would recommend that one, but I wouldn't blame someone for not completely enjoying it the first time around.
I mean, there are plenty of movies like that are you had to watch them a couple times to fully grasp what's going on. But yeah, I think I've heard of that one before. It was like on a list of like the top 10 weirdest silent movies or something like that. But I haven't actually watched the movie itself. Do you have any other recommendations, or is that just the only one that you can think of?
Well, I know that all of Chaplin's movies are well known, but like I know Harold Lloyd is of course really famous, but I think most people just think of Safety Last, which is of course great, but like all of his movies were great, and I think a lot of them don't get that much attention in comparison. So I guess I could consider them underrated in a way. Like for example, I like The Freshman. That's kind of his second most famous movie, but like Hot Water 2 is really good from 1925. 6, I think. And it's kind of one of his gag movies, so the story isn't very strong, but it just has, Harold Lloyd had the best gags, really, really cool stuff in his features. So I really enjoyed that one. There's like this really interesting kitchen sequence, which showcases a lot of 1920s kitchen utensils and like a kitchen setup. So that in itself is kind of cool. And then you can see the comedy with it is also, it just makes it even better.
Yeah, to go off on a little bit of a tangent, Harold Lloyd was very controlling with the copyright of his movies, which is, I think, played a huge role in making him less well-known than Charlie Chaplin and Buster Keaton. Because, they've had movies that were in the public domain before the full possible amount of time that it could have been covered. So, like The General, for example, that one was made in 1926, and it would have entered the public domain last year if it had remained copyrighted, but its copyright lapsed long before then. So with more of these, like you were saying, you didn't have any money, so you're watching these silent movies that were free. So there's a bunch of, not really so much today, but back in the day when you would go to Blockbuster or all these video rental places, they had those DVD sets that had a bunch of old public domain movies on them. They would release public domain movies on VHS, and people would be able to have easy access to these movies because of the lack of copyright. But because Harold Lloyd, when they reached out to him in the 50s and 60s to try to get his movies shown on TV, he wanted them to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars to do that. So that's why they ended up not going with that. And, obviously since there was less exposure, fewer people were watching it. And so now that his stuff is finally becoming public domain, more people are watching it now.
I also heard that he demanded that the musical accompaniment be an organ because that's how they were supposed to be. And if it was a piano, he just would refuse.
I didn't hear about that one, but that is interesting. Are there any movies from the 20s that you think should be remade for a modern audience?
I think it's good to make them for a modern audience. I just kind of worry about how it will be done because, I think of Disney remakes these days, and I kind of groan to myself. I guess anything that involved a lot of good special effects, like maybe Wings. Of course, for the time, the special effects were amazing. They were all practical effects, but I wonder how that could be done in a modern movie, some World War I action dog fighting and things like that.
Well, there are some movies that have that, and they're all of varying quality, and they have CGI, which depending on the movie, it could be good, could suck. You could some of them it is Star Wars quality and looks really good, and some of them it looks what's the term that I'm looking for?
Uncanny Valley?
No, it looks like. Have you ever seen Beast Wars?
No.
Okay, that's the worst CGI thing that I can think of. So moving on from movies to songs. Which songs from the 1920s do you think would be popular if they were released today?
Probably all the different dance songs, because that's something that's kind of continued up to now. There's always been a dance craze at every point in time pretty much, and the 1920s had so many of them, and everyone, well, not everyone, but a lot of people like to dance. It's kind of a fun social activity, so things like the Charleston, the Black Bottom, the Varsity Drag, the Raccoon, all those would be kind of fun ones, I think. And especially the college ones like Varsity Drag and the Raccoon. I feel like those could be really fun, especially, in college when everyone's trying to have a good time and things like that.
I guess that makes sense. I did go into this already knowing that you like the Black Bottom a lot. From my perspective, I think, love songs do tend to be pretty timeless for the most part. And there are a lot of songs about loneliness and heartbreak that I've definitely found in the 20s. It's pretty crazy, actually, just how many of the songs that I found have been about being lonely. There's All By Myself by Irving Berlin, All Alone Monday, I don't remember who made that one. Also, All Alone by Irving Berlin, Me and My Shadow, Me and the Man in the Moon. I think those are all pretty good. Me and the Man in the Moon is one of it's my favorite song right now.
I like the Ukulele Ike version.
Yeah. I think that one would probably catch on today, but I think, people need to be able to hear more of this stuff. So I know you've had some issues with copyright strikes and claims and stuff. Do you want to talk a little bit about that, your experiences with those?
Yeah, so that happened a few years ago now. And at first, I wanted my channel to not just be just the articles, like just the print articles and the documentary videos. I also wanted it to be an archive channel, but that ended up not working out at all. I don't really know if, I guess I just didn't understand it at the time because I just had a movie downloaded from like 1920 and I thought, well, this is in the public domain. And I looked it up and it said, you know, just a film restoration in itself doesn't qualify as a derivative copyright, from what I read. So I thought I was all set to go. And lo and behold, I got 2 copyright strikes kind of right after each other. The first one was some cartoons, and I think it might have been because the file I uploaded contained a title screen that indicated exactly what DVD it came from, and I guess that was copyrighted because all the cartoons in them, like within the DVD that I uploaded, were all from 1923 and before, so they all should have been in the public domain at that time. And yeah, this person, I will leave unnamed, contacted me, and it ended up being a copyright strike. I got 2 videos taken down, but 1 strike. And then the next one was a movie from 1920. So once again, I thought, well, this has been in the public domain for a long time because, you know, it's before 1923, and those have been in the public domain for, I'm not sure how long, but much longer than like the, you know, each year we get some put in. It was kind of before that law had been standing for a while. So I really thought I was safe on that one, but the distribution company for it, copyright striked it, and I tried to reach out to them. I was just trying to make a deal, like, you know, I don't mind deleting the video and never uploading it again if you just like take away the strike, but I never got a response back. So that just kind of destroyed my hope of having an archive aspect to my channel.
Well, at least there's there's already a lot of YouTube channels that do that. But like the YouTube copyright system is just a complete mess, that as anyone can tell you. But like even though I've been very careful about making sure that I'm using public domain materials for the things that I've uploaded, I've gotten a lot of not copyright strikes, but claims on videos that had old recordings from 1922 and before, even though, as you know, they recently entered the public domain. Usually, if I dispute it, it'll go away, but sometimes they say that they still own the copyright to it, which is not true. But there's only so much that you can do at that point. You know, it's not humans reviewing every single thing until it gets to that point where it's necessary.
Yeah, they'd be facing a lot of like legal problems if, you know, people were flagging things that shouldn't be and whatnot. So I get YouTube why they don't want to get too involved, because then they don't want to be liable for anything.
Anyway, that's all the questions that I have listed. So thank you for being on the show. It was great having you.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
That's all the time we have for today's episode. Be sure to check out the 1920s channel, which is linked in the description. Also, don't forget to like this video, subscribe if you haven't already, support this channel on Ko-fi if you feel so inclined, and ring the notification bell so you won't miss what comes next from It's Free IP.